So the first quote that I have here is something that came from a conversation between Professor Gadgil and his own father. And this is something that kind of captures where we are as a people as well. So his father tells him that I believe that we need electricity to drive industrial progress, but it should not be, with all these environmental and social costs. So that's pretty much how today we, like all of us, see this whole environmentalism, ecology, and all of that. We want progress, we want all the material benefits, industrialization, all that, but we also want to balance with these environmental and social costs. So here Professor Gadgil talks about plantations, which is a construct that really started with the colonial era. And then here he talks about that how the planters held the common people of India in contempt, forcing them to work on the plantations under conditions akin to slavery. And he says that their attitude towards nature conservation was that only those with money and authority, in particular, like the state entities, like the forest department bureaucracy, they should protect nature. In their view, the common people of India and their livestock, that was a menace to wilderness, and it must be denied access to forests in order for nature conservation efforts to succeed. So here there is a dichotomy that's sort of seen where you have the forest department, bureaucracy, and the planters, and that in one end, who see that it's pretty much like a colonizer kind of a perspective, where they see that we are the ones who know what to do, and the common people are the ones who need to be shown their place. Maintenance of resources, and everyone is operating with short-term greed or survival focus. So I think that is really the challenge that we are at. That none of us are really in a position if we are operating in a survival focus, right? Like if you're not even rich enough, and if you're like living from mouthful to mouthful, or like a hand to mouth kind of an existence, this kind of a discourse cannot even come near you because you are just concerned about your meal for that day. So there is that audience who do not even get into this discourse anymore because they are just concerned about like eking out their livelihood. And then there are people like us who are not in that state, but of course they are also in this whole treadmill of modernity, and we are also unable to step out because we are all also trained in this growth and like limitless growth and greed and short-term return on investment, profits, getting rich, net worth, market capitalization, that sort of mindset. And pretty much everybody is operating this mindset, so much so that there are very few of us who can really like put their foot down and then say that we have a stake in the long-term intergenerational sustenance of these resources. Yep. Okay. So thanks for the introduction. I think we're just going to spend more time on this book. It's a very important book on a very important topic. What I'm going to do is really to go through what I termed as a critical reflection on this book from my lens, which is the way I look at the world, mostly from a traditional or a dharmic standpoint. And this book is particularly important for those who are interested in this, what I call the dharma ecology economy interface. So just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I'm going to use like a lot of excerpts from the book, and all of this, the assumption is that it's all fair use and there's no commercial interest involved. The purpose is clearly research or academic, and please consider the book if interested, and it's available all over the internet, so you can always buy that. All right. So I'll start with some context setting around Professor Gadgil's own background. So of course, we spoke about his, let's say, academic or professional bio, which is all the Padma Awards that he got and the immense contribution that he has done to policy making, ecology, and all of that. But what's interesting about this book is also it helped to kind of understand his worldview, so to say. So the first quote that I have here is something that came from a conversation between Professor Gadgil and his own father. And this is something that kind of captures where we are as a people as well. So his father tells him that I believe that we need electricity to drive industrial progress, but it should not be, with all these environmental and social costs. So that's pretty much how today we, like all of us, see this whole environmentalism, ecology, and all of that. We want progress. We want all the material benefits, industrialization, all that. But we also want to balance with these environmental and social costs. So it's interesting that Professor Gadgil begins the book this way. And then, of course, the considering the fact that the lot of this background is from Maharashtra, and there's a lot of political context around Maharashtra in that era. Gadgil also talks about his own father's background, which is again quite interesting, both of his father and mother. So he speaks about how his father considered that caste was a disgrace, and he decided that he will not belong to any particular caste. And then his mother's family belongs to a progressive group or called the Pradhana Samaj, which had also rejected the Hindu caste system. And Gadgil said his parents were united in the rejection of caste, and they never even had any Brahmin enter the. He also talks about how a lot of these idealistic notions were not shared with the society at large, and over time, a lot of people really didn't take to these ideals at scale. So he talks about how not everybody is refusing to perform the thread ceremonies of their sons because they believe that caste-specific rituals should be done away with. So at some level, he feels that these things need to go away, and there's a sort of a lament that somehow we are still clinging on to these traditions. Now it's interesting that this sort of a background of Gadgil is what the book starts with, because through the book, Professor Gadgil, from an ecological lens, he does lament about the loss of a lot of traditional knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledge. And in here, when it comes to like his own family background and his own uh, religious context, he is talking about letting go of traditions. So that's a dichotomy that one would see all through the book, where when it comes to what one can call his own strand of tradition, there's a lot of this sort of rejection that one sees. But when one zooms out and looks at the society at large, there's a lot of appreciation for tradition and a lot of wonder on or a lot of lament on the place of these traditional knowledge systems and traditional way of lives in the context of modernity. So that dichotomy is something that caught me as I read through the book. So I just wanted to bring that up first, because at some level, all of us also have this dichotomy, because as I said, we want development, but we also want to be ecological. We want to be modern, but we also want to be traditional. So that sort of uh, captures where all of us are on this particular matter. Now, there's a lot of references to Buddha at the start of the book, Gautam Buddha. So there's one conversation that Professor Gadgil refers to at 2, 3 different places in the book. So that is this one that is seen on the screen, a particular discussion on in the Ashwalayan Sutta. So here Ashwalayan claims that different varnas are like different species of animals. And then Buddha apparently asks that whether the progeny from the intermarriage of a Brahmin and Kshatriya would be healthy and fertile. And then Ashwalayan says that they would be perfectly healthy. And then Buddha retorts that then they are of the same species. Essentially, that if you are really of a like belonging to a different species, then you perhaps should not have restrictions. I mean, then it probably makes sense to have intermarriage restrictions. But when you are of the same species, as proven clearly that the progeny will not have any health issues or fertility issues, then you're really not a species. So this is again coming from a context, as we saw in the previous slide. There's a lot of rejection of caste as a concept and the role of caste in the individual's life. So sort of Professor Gadgil's reading of Buddha is also coming from there, where he sees Buddha as this sort of an anti-caste or like anti-intermarriage, that sort of a position. And this mudra you see on the screen is also interesting, because Gadgil says that the only statue that he specially commissioned from a sculptor friend of his is this Buddha in this what's called the Bhum Sparsha Mudra. As you can see, the hand of Buddha is touching the ground here. So apparently, when Buddha attained enlightenment, he pointed to the ground, signaling that his enlightenment was achieved through his experiences of Mother Earth and not through any divine inspiration or intervention. So he was a true rationalist, and like scientists, he believed the objective facts are the basis of all knowledge. This is really how Professor Gadgil understands Buddha in this context. And as you can clearly see, he's a man of science, and then he also has a lot of misgivings around his own tradition, his own past, and all of that. So, not so surprisingly, in Buddha, he sees that icon who attained enlightenment, and he also sees Buddha as like a rationalist icon. Now, this context setting is important because this dichotomy is something that you'll see throughout this particular talk today, where the moment there is a reference to anything around caste, there is a bit of this whole thing of but it's just a social construct, it's just a human construct, why are we so picky about it, kind of thing. And then suddenly when he jumps over to understanding the functions of caste in the society, it changes all over. And then he starts talking about the role of caste in the role of tradition in balancing a lot of man's greed and in terms of governance and all of that. So that's the reason why I brought this up at the start of this talk. So this book is something that Professor Gadgil again refers to at the start of his own discourse in terms of how it has shaped his worldview. So this is some book that is like quite popular in Marathi literature primarily. It's called Gavgada, and this is something I think it's pretty much in the early part of the 20th century. And I happened to read this book as well after seeing this reference. I read the English translation, of course, because I'm not trained in Marathi. So in this book, there's a lot of reference to how village community functioned at that point in time. And there is also a lot of commentary in terms of what was the role of each individual member and like each individual community and all of that. So here, Professor Gadgil talks about Dalit Mahars as one particular example. So Mahar is a particular jati which today is categorized under Dalits by our system. And that's the jati that Baba Saheb Ambedkar also belonged to. And this jati served as guards for the village as well as the community lands of the village. And then here, Professor Gadgil says that these Mahars, they were responsible for collecting firewood for the community forest land, and they were also supplying it to various households in the village. They also served as the guards of the village, as I mentioned. And looking at these diverse roles for the Mahar community, Gadgil remarks that probably this sort of a governing resource governance sort of a role is what helped ensure the tree stock was not overexploited. So here, essentially, book they look at each community, what was the role of that particular jati or community in the village, and then try and understand how that shaped or how that governed that particular occupation, resource utilization, so on. So from a ecologist sort of a lens, Professor Gadgil here is really saying that this kind of a function that was allocated to various castes, this probably helped preserve the green mantle over much of the country. So he does say that the society was iniquitous in the sense that it was not an equal society. Everybody could not do everything. But then despite the fact that this was an iniquitous society, it did have its own like a management and governance mechanisms around some of the resource management and ecological aspects. So that is what Professor Gadgil refers to here. And then he switches over to talk about what really changed in the colonial epoch. So here, Professor Gadgil talks about plantations, which is a construct that really started with the colonial era. And then here he talks about that how the planters held the common people of India in contempt, forcing them to work on the plantations under conditions akin to slavery. And he says that their attitude towards nature conservation was that only those with money and authority, in particular, like the state entities, like the forest department bureaucracy, they should protect nature. In their view, the common people of India and their livestock, that was a menace to wilderness, and it must be denied access to forests in order for nature conservation efforts to succeed. So here there is a dichotomy that's sort of seen where you have the forest department bureaucracy and the planters and that in one end who see that it's pretty much like a colonizer kind of a perspective where they see that we are the ones who know what to do and the common people are the ones who need to be shown their place. So as mentioned here, the common people were shown as a menace to that wilderness, which is the wild areas and forests and all of that. So there is always this thing that the forestry department is the one which needs to dictate terms. So this through the book, and we will also touch upon that through the talk today, that there is this thing, this whole entity of the state and the British state, then the forestry department, all of that coming up as an authority which the people at large were very unfamiliar of, because that is not the way that the country operated prior to the colonial epoch. So here, that's really the import that there is this whole new entities that got really created. Now, this is where if we zoom out, Professor Gadgil also talks about various other new entities that have sprung up across the world. You see, this logo is familiar to a lot of us. This is WWF, the Worldwide Fund, now called the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So, World Wildlife Fund, it was originally called, and then now I think it's Worldwide Fund for Nature. So these entities also really are European entities that got created sometime in the last 200 years. And here Gadgil says that just as white Europeans had discovered the charms of wilderness in North America after destroying it, the Europeans have now established these bodies to preach nature conservation to Asians and Africans, and pretty much like other communities in rest of the world as well. So it is as if like these communities don't know how to conserve nature and they need to be taught, or they don't have enough authorities or bodies to manage, and they need the creation of these new entities. So again, there is of that whole colonizer kind of an attitude seen if you go back to how these entities got created. So here again, Professor Gadgil draws attention to North America and United States. So sometimes when we talk about this topic, in general, one retort that we hear is that, hey, but you say that traditional communities like India or Africa or any of these colonized countries, they have a lot of their own conservation and traditional knowledge management and resource management systems. But if you look at the world today, most of the greenery and whatever is preserved well is all in the same places where colonization happened. So they draw a reference to the national parks in the US and then say, look how good they are and look how we manage our own forests today. And then they kind of like flip it and then say that perhaps the way the US manages things is what we need to learn from, and not try to like go back and try to connect to our ways of doing things and all of that. So here, Professor Gadgil tries again to draw a lesson in history, where he says that Americans today claim that the Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872, that was the oldest of the true wilderness preserved anywhere in the world, while they remain unwilling to concede that ecological prudence is as ancient heritage, and it is an ancient heritage which resulted in several praiseworthy practices in many different civilizations. So what European settlers thought was pristine wilderness of Yellowstone landscape, it had actually been used and preserved over centuries by the Amerindian native people. This is what Gadgil says. Essentially, what he's saying is that we're looking at this landscape and then now calling it a national park and saying that, like, look how I am managing it. But then if you just go back a few years behind, then this landscape was actually used by a lot of native people and also preserved. So they did both using and preserving. It was not just about like protecting it as a park and then disconnecting it from rest of community life. It was used and preserved. And here he draws a reference to a particular mountain in Mongolia, the Bothkan mountain. And this mountain is also consumed by the Mongolians, so much so that the local people neither hunt nor harvest the timber on that mountain. And he also refers to similar such practices all through India as well. You take Shabarimala or Tirumala or Tiruvannamalai for that matter, or Bhimashankar. A lot of these are essentially examples of sacred protected. The forests are living in those forests. So it's sort of like a connected system where all of it is seen as one whole. Continuing on this trajectory, where Professor Gadgil is talking about how the kind of operate. All society has past 200 years, famous name Bombay Natural History Society. So on these kind of entities as well, Professor Gadgil really strives to of originated. Look at how things were. We never this, but all right, okay. Uh, so this Bombay Natural History Society that came up, let's say, somewhere in the 20th century or abouts. So this one again is a society that was modeled on the lines of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, is what Gadgil says. And then he says that these are societies of imperialists, for imperialists, and by imperialists. If you look at the Bombay Natural History Society's the about section today, even now it clearly says that I think it is about like of the 12 of the founding members, about 10 of them were Europeans. It is almost like when colonists studied its wildlife on these newfound lands, and then they began to think of nature conservation. At the same time, ignoring what they did in terms of enslaving, hunting, and eliminating all the native peoples in North and South America, so on. So these are really entities that have a lot of colonial import in terms of their structural foundations and philosophies. And in this book, Gadgil tries to draw some attention into that part. So this is a very specific example in terms of how the colonial epoch interfaced with our communities. So here, what you see on the screen, this image is really an office that still exists in Goa today, although in a bit of like a close to a dilapidated sort of a condition. This is the administrative office for what is called the communidades, community resource management entity that existed from the Portuguese era time. And before that, the Portuguese era, they themselves, the full that was influenced from this thing that there are a lot of qualifiers put around caste system, and then only this whole understanding appreciation starts. So I put it verbatim because I think that is important to understand. So here, Prof. says that Goa's village communities suffered from the evils of their own localities' natural resources. Such village community institutions prevailing all over India were destroyed in British India to facilitate colonizers' drain of India's resources, including those in community managed forests that were brought under the control of the state forest departments. So again, going back to what was referred to in a couple of slides ago. So there is this whole entity that was created called the state-based forest departments, and they took over whatever power and control and resources that these community-based institutions had, and the state forest department sort of imposed a top-down bureaucratic structure with the British epoch. Here, specifically in the case of Goa, the Portuguese attempted to dissolve the village community governance, but they gave up later because they in retaining it, and it was also leading to a loss in agricultural production because it was something very different from how agriculture was being conducted otherwise. So Goa had retained this village community level governance for a long time. It was called Gaon Kari, then termed as the community system by the Portuguese. So this was the secret of Goa's retention of its verdure or greenery, despite the iniquities of the caste system, till its liberation in 1961. That's how Gadgil concludes his commentary on this Gaon Kari system. And this system continues to exist today, albeit in a very different kind of a manifestation. If you like today Google for this, you'd still find some discussion on the community system even as recent as like a couple of months ago. So this system still exists, and it is still fighting with the uh, let's say the government bureaucracy and the whole state as an entity, and they are fighting for their own rights and like what is the relevance of that system with all the modernity that is around us. So I think a lot of these issues are really in the present continuous tense. They are not about something that existed in the past. These are things that either exist in memory or in practice in some shape. And these are questions that people continue to grapple with in terms of between the individual state and market. Is there something else? If you have something called a community, what is the basis of that community? And if you have something that is passed on, how do you see that in light of all the modernity around? So I think this particular case gives a good example of that. Now, interestingly, when he's talking about all this, there are some places where Gadgil also switches off to a totally different trajectory in terms of tradition. And here I just wanted to call out a couple of instances. One on the Khandavana Dahana from Mahabharata, and then he also refers to what is called Mrigaswapnapaya. So this particular commentary on the Khandavana Dahana is something that I'm familiar with in the sense of having found this in a lot of Indologist and historicist readings. And this is not something that any traditionalist rendition of Mahabharata would really capture. And I think it's a very historicist reading of trying to put a date on a particular event and then trying to relate everything around that particular event. So here, Khandavana Dahana in see it's a tale of expansion of agricultural population demanding more and more land. And that land needs to come at the cost of forest and its dwellers, both animal and human. So as champions of this land or agriculture-based civilization, he says that Krishna and Arjuna mercilessly burned down the Kandava forest, killing the animals as well as the Naga tribals dwelling therein to make room for the expansion of agriculture near the capital of Indraprastha. Again, as I said, this is not something that you would find in any traditional sort of a reading, but this is something that you would find in a lot of historicists, Indologists, the kind of renditions on Mahabharata. So Gadgil does talk about the fact that not all, let's say, animals or humans or other entities were killed in this Dahana. There were exceptions, and that story is like quite well documented in Mahabharata. So I won't get into those details here. It's just that it's interesting that this is seen as an instance where, as it's told here, that Krishna and Arjuna are mercilessly burning down. So it is not that all forests are burned down. This particular forest is a particular instance, and this is a backstory behind it. So it's kind of interesting and maybe somewhat disappointing to also see this kind of a generalization. Again, as I said, this is something that has happened time and again in the past before. So I think that's how things are when you start looking at your own past from a certain kind of a lens. And then here he also refers to a contrasting narrative of Mrugaswapnabhaya from Airavati Karve's Yuganta. So Airavati Karve also happens to be a relation to Professor Gadgil, and there are also some references in terms of how her own works influenced his childhood and how he sees like things in new light based on her writings. So here he talks about Mruga Swapna Bhaya, which is Mruga is animal, Swapna is dream, and Bhaya is fear. So essentially, it is about a particular fear that came from a dream of animals. So here they are dwelling in a forest while in exile, and they used to hunt on a large scale for food and sport. So one day the animals appear in Dharmaraja's dream and told him that they were all on the way to rapid extermination given the rate at which they were being hunted. So they requested Pandavas to move to another forest and come back only after their populations had recovered. So this then the Pandavas did. So they moved out from that location, and that Professor Gadgil says is an instance where we were displaying ecological prudence, which means that we realized that we were over exploiting and we'll shift to a different location. Again, this is a bit of a like a very interesting or different kind of commentary on this, but nevertheless, this incident does exist in various versions of Mahabharata in various shapes, and this particular uh, aspect of animals being in fear and coming to Dharmaraja and requesting about it, I think this is quite well known. Just that here, in terms of his own lens, Gadgil is seeing this as an instance of ecological prudence, because that means you have some sense that you have hit a limit and you have exploited it a lot, so you better move on. So this is some sort of prudence that he keeps referring to, that humans are perhaps the only ones who can cultivate this kind of a prudence, unlike animals who cannot think through this far. And he gives a reference to a lot of Indian traditions that one thing that they excelled in, despite all the iniquities, was that they had this prudence. So on this aspect, I think there's a lot of research Gadgil has done on sacred grooves. And in this book, we find a lot of references to sacred grooves as well. So for those of us who are not that familiar with sacred grooves are essentially parts of forests or plantations, even closer to plains and villages, which are dedicated or undisturbed and typically unexploited as well. And they are kind of like reservations within the geography that other activities, typically other exploitative activities, will not be performed there. So here, Gadgil says that the running hypothesis among nature conservationists is that the sacred groves, they represent a lingering element of nature worship that is prevalent in all primitive societies, and they had no secular function, and they persisted purely because of superstition. So this is one view where people say that you are just considering it as sacred because you are just superstitious, as like you think that gods reside there, so you're not going there. And then Gadgil, of course, given all the context that was provided at the start of the talk, is also that there's a lot of rationalism and secularism in his perspective. And he sees that maybe they're not just superstitions, maybe they are not just about sacred, maybe they also have a secular purpose. So a lot of in his own discourse, what he tries to do is he tries to search for a rational explanation for why that groove was left alone. And then in this part of the book, he kind of documents the rational or resource management explanation for why these sacred grooves are the way they are. So these grooves are protected for the water sources, and they are sheltered for valuable medicinal plants, and they also serve as refugia for animals that are hunted outside the sacred groves. So these are various purposes of these sacred groves, and Gadgil writes a lot about those through the book. Now, interestingly, if you look around in the country, you would find this sacred groves as something that has that's pretty much present in every single region of the country, although it may have different names in different places. So, in part of Himachal Pradesh, maybe it's called Devban, and elsewhere in the northeast or in Meghalaya, it may have a different name. But essentially, this concept per se exists everywhere. And here, there's a particular example that Gadgil gives to Mangaon in Ambi Valley and writes about how Mangaon had one of the largest sacred groves. And the villagers there reported that it sheltered a breeding population of barking deer, which was left unharmed inside the grove, but was from time to time hunted if they are seen outside. So again, if you'll see this sort of a balance where it is not to say that hunting is banned. It is just that hunting is banned inside the grove. So the barking deer can stay within the groove, and in the groove it serves as some sort of a refuge area for the that particular deer. And then once it is out, it can potentially be hunted. So it is this ecological prudence of using available resources within agreed upon limits while continuing to work on conservation of the resource without exploiting or exhausting. That is what Gadgil argues that traditional knowledge systems and traditions had. And even if you keep the sacred aspects aside, this in itself is worth to consider in terms of their relevance for the way we need to look at our own resources today. That's pretty much the kind of tone and direction that he takes through the book. And this, he says, is found to be lacking in the models and practices that are uh, adopted by urban dwellers and forestry officials and administrations at large today. So today, when we look at a typical developmentalist lens of looking at these grooves, they'll just say that it is superstitious and there's no harm in really exploiting them because there's no downside to it, and they'll mostly like put an economic value on that particular groove, and they'll proceed to take over. So like this is a conflict that even in popular cinema, like in the movie Kantara, for example, you could see this where there is a sense of sacred and there is a developmentalist ambition. So what you see as a picture here is also a reference to another Mangaon Taluka in Pune district, and it's called Janani Ai Devrai. So Devrai is a term in Maharashtra for sacred groves. So Dev is God and Rai is forest. So these are sacred groves situated in the Western Ghats of Maharashtra. And interestingly, this particular sacred grove has a temple which was frequented by Jijabai, who is Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj's mother, and that's present in this sacred grove. And the traditional belief is that gods are present in these temples and they protect this particular forest area. So again, this is a very different view from a strictly rationalist or modernist or developmentalist lens. And the point here being that this is how, like, this is who we are as Indian people. This is how we were looking at nature, and we need to be mindful of it when we get into this whole developmentalist catch-up kind of a race with the rest of the world, and we take to limitless exploitation of our bodies. So at some point, you need to understand that we are not an atheist people, and we are not a people who don't have a notion of sacred. We do have a notion of sacred, and we need to go back to our own memories and our own practices, and then develop our own methodologies in terms of how we can develop limits around not being like overexploited. So that is really the import around this whole discourse around sacred groves here. So one last mention on sacred groves before I move on to another topic. So here there is a very specific episode that is recollected from how sacred groves were looked at in Manipur. So Manipur, Mizoram, and that whole area in Northeast, it typically doesn't get as much brain time and attention from uh, rest of the people in India who are into this kind of discourse. And it is it's very heartening to see this kind of call outs from Professor Gadgil in his book. So interestingly, here what he talks about is how Manipuri community elders, they recollected their own past and their present. So elders in Manipur, they vividly remembered the traditional system that had changed only about like 40, 50 years ago in the 1950s. So this is from Gadgil's field research. So it's not something that he's talking about something that happened now in this year or the past. It's mostly about what happened in, let's say, in about 90s or so. So these elders reported that in the past, up to 30% of the land and water were fully protected as sacred sites, and certain valued resources such as bamboo and aquilaria with its fragrant wood, they were harvested with great care. So again, here you'll see these boundaries defined, but that 30% of the land is sacred. It's not for exploitation or commercial activities, and it is deemed sacred. And then there is some policing that is happening around resources. And then when the British established control over this region in 1908 onwards, they assigned the ownership of all land to tribal chiefs, reducing the rest of the populace as sharecroppers. Many of these chiefs forcibly liquidated the forest to make a quick buck. And then here Gadgil says that this was a revelation to him because he thought that the community indeed retained ownership. But right from the colonial epoch, the ownership kind of changed from the community to the kings and then from the kings to the British. So here he says that while it started this way, greater damage followed in the 1950s when the missionaries converted the tribal society of many of the northeastern states to Christianity. Again, this is very difficult to state today given all the politics around it, but there is indeed a difference in which mainstream Christianity looks at nature and how a lot of what is called pagan belief systems look at nature. So in that sense, from their lens, perhaps we are also pagans. Although from our lens, we need not define ourselves that. But the way we look at sacred is different from the way the Christian society look at it. And this hostility to the pagan beliefs led to the destruction of the large network of sacred groves and ponds. So once this version happened in Manipur, that is when a lot more damage of further sacred groves happened, is what Professor Gadgil says. Again, he refers to how a tiny Buddhist country close to Manipur, there this did happen because it didn't come under colonial rule and neither did it come under missionary influence. And it still harbors a network of sacred groves that is estimated to cover about 20% of the land surface. So he's referring to the way Bhutan managed its resources because it was still operating in a traditional mold without a lot of colonial influence and without a lot of missionary influence. So here Gadgil also writes about how, unlike in Manipur, the sacred groves in Mizoram had been retained largely intact. Now here, although the Christianity adoption happened and they no longer attribute sacredness to them, at least they considered it as like a safety forest or like a reserve forest. And some of them, they were subject to restrained harvests and they were called supply forests. So here, Gadgil notes how erstwhile sacred mechanisms got replaced with secular community-based vigilance mechanisms. So there's a lot of complex interplay of various forces that are happening here. I think what we need to be mindful of is that belief systems also have a role to play here. And this is something that some of the mainstream research that is available in ecology and environmentalism, like the paper by Lynn White Jr. in the 60s, which talks about the historical roots of our ecological crisis. Even there, this contrast is drawn between Christian versus pagan sort of a worldview, where in the pagan worldview, there are deities associated with trees, deities associated with forests, deities associated with rivers, so on. And that kind of changed with the Christianization of those societies. So we need to be mindful of this fact that just because you consider something as sacred, it doesn't mean someone from another worldview also will consider it as sacred. And as we go through this whole developmentalist competition, we should also be aware of, are we becoming something else, in the sense that are we not paying enough attention to our own sacred, and are we moving closer and closer to let's say how the uh, Christian cultures looked at pagan beliefs? Are we really going that far in terms of our own notions of sacred? So I think that is a note of caution that we need to be mindful of in this whole development, ecology, economy sort of interface. Now here, Gadgil refers to some of the transitions that have happened in a lot of these traditional communities And this is again something that's very important for all of us, because people like me and mostly people who are listening to this talk are all essentially they'll all be English educated, they'll all be either studying or they'll be professionally in a well-to-do sort of a space, and they are kind of wondering the role of tradition in their lives and the society at large. And so essentially we have all uh, been a part of this whole modernity journey or modernizing journey, and at some level we have also like consumed the fruits of modernity. But we are at this juncture where we are also wondering, then what, or what does it mean from a traditional perspective and all of that. So this is here that Professor Gadgil talks about some of the his own interactions with the fisherman community or fisher folk in general. So he talks about this, that some of the Japanese people, they sent a trawler to train the Indian fisher folk in this new technology. Essentially, it is mechanized fishing, and they were doing traditional fishing or manual fishing before. So when these mechanized fishing trawlers came in, the local fisher folk, they really expressed their apprehension, saying that the way these trawlers are disturbing the sea bottom, it may hurt fish breeding, and in the long run, it may have an adverse impact, because the machine doesn't really have any limits and it doesn't really care either in terms of the long-term consequences. So this is what Professor Gadgil talks as a precautionary principle. And he says that we now realize that such apprehensions of the local folks are well-founded. So here again, a contrast is drawn between how a traditional sort of a view is seen on this sort of a fishery exploitative kind of a mechanism, and how a technological mindset kind of sees it. So in the technological mindset, there is no sense of a long run, and there is also no sense of a limit in terms of whether what if this hurts fish breeding, what if this hurts the availability of fish for the next generation, so on. So that's a contrast that is being drawn here. Again, another similar example, that traditional beach sailors, they worked in cooperative groups within well demarcated territories, and for centuries they had sustainably exploited the inshore stocks of prawn and mackerel. So the word here used really is sustainably exploited, meaning you didn't overexploit. You are indeed doing fishing, but you knew your limits. So introduction of mechanized boats, trawlers, and purse seiners, that led to rapid overexploitation and depletion of inshore stocks. That's what Professor Gargill writes. So entrepreneurs from non-fishing communities who owned these boats, they were interested not in the sustenance of the fisheries, but in obtaining a quick return on their investment. So this is again the typical, let's say, the modern business or a capitalist sort of a mindset that is coming in here, which doesn't care for long term, which doesn't care for the sustenance of the resources. Because essentially, if the fish stocks are exhausted, they had the option of giving up fishing as a business enterprise and investing in some other venture. Or maybe if this water body is done, you'll just switch gear and go to some other water body. But the traditional fisherman, his worldview is all roaming around that particular water body and his role situated in that particular water body. So for him, sustenance is important. For him, the sustenance of the fisher stock is important because he sees his intergenerational sustenance from that lens. So that is the difference in worldview between a traditional fisherman and how an entrepreneur from a non-fishing community, or for that matter, an entrepreneur trained in a modern mindset, even if he is from the fishing community, would look at it. So they were really looking at from a return on investment perspective, and the fishermen, the traditional communities themselves, they were looking at from a sustenance perspective. So again, the key word here is sustainably exploited, meaning that they are using the resource, which is the fishes in the water bodies, but they're also mindful of not over exploiting it or just exploiting it dry. So here, I think what we need to understand in terms of how we look at resource management as individuals and as people participating in the economy as a whole, and as citizens, of course, is that in the modernizing India or in modern India in general, a lot of us now operate like these entrepreneurs cited above from non-fishing communities who got into fishing. We do not have a stake in the long-term intergenerational sustenance of resources, and everyone is operating with short-term greed or survival focus. So I think that is really the challenge that we are at, that none of us are really in a position, if we are operating in a survival focus, right? Like if you're not even rich enough, and if you're like living from mouthful to mouthful, or like a hand-to-mouth kind of an existence, this kind of a discourse cannot even come near you because you are just concerned about your meal for that day. So there is that audience who do not even get into this discourse anymore because they are just concerned about like eking out their livelihood. And then there are people like us who are not in that state, but of course they are also in this whole treadmill of modernity, and we are also unable to step out because we are all also trained in this growth and like limitless growth and greed and short-term return on investment, profits, getting rich, net worth, market capitalization, that sort of mindset. And pretty much everybody is operating this mindset. So much so that there are very few of us who can really like put their foot down and then say that we have a stake in the long-term intergenerational sustenance of these resources. In fact, we don't even talk that much about long-term intergenerational sustenance of like our own kind. Even in terms of our own succession, in terms of what we are leaving it for our next generations, there is not enough thought put into. So that is where Gadgil says that one may contrast two very distinct approaches to the utilization of natural resource. So a community which is traditionally dependent on and expects to continue its dependence for generations to come on a particular resource, it has much at stake in its long-term conservation. In fact, our village communities, they had created many regulations for sustained utilization of these renewable resources on which they depended on. That is what Gadgil writes. So here again, a clear distinction is drawn that this particular community, you may call it a caste, you may call it a village, or you may call it whatever. But these are communities that have traditionally depended on a particular resource, and they expect to continue this dependence for generations to come. And they have much at stake in the long-term conservation. So when they are looking at any new introduction into their practice and any change into their regulation or their way of life in general, they think long term, they think beyond one generation. And that's a certain worldview. And these village communities, hence, they had created many regulations and many taboos and many rules and many stigmas associated with a lot of these resources. So again, while Gadgil is very critical about a lot of iniquitous aspects of the caste system in general, he is also appreciative of this fact that there is a reason why these regulations are in place. And here he is trying to draw that contrast that if you are invested intergenerationally, then you may also have some regulations around resource management. So here there's a bit more talk in terms of some more community traditions. So Gadgil gives an example of how freshwater fish from Yamuna River was an important protein source for the people of Theri and Garhwal. So this resources was exploited in significant numbers only in a single festival day in July at a place below Kempty. So the picture I put there is from the Kempty Falls. And on this day, the fish would be killed with poison and harvested for a communal feast. Poisoning was forbidden on any other time of the year with a threat of excommunication. And regular fishing was carried out only outside the monsoon season. So again, you can see here that there's a lot of community policing happening. That you can have a lot of fish, you can kill a lot of them, you can in fact poison them, but only on a particular day. And only on that particular day, the communal feast also happens, and over exploitation really is for that particular day. And regular fishing, which means not in a very exploitative manner, but more as like at a sustenance sort of a scale, that can happen outside the monsoon season. And poisoning per se is prohibited at any other time of the year except for that one particular designated day. So again, here there is a threat of excommunication that is talked about. So today we look at like caste as evil, excommunication, untouchability, and all of that. But then in this particular instance, there is a rationale behind the excommunication, which is that of resource governance. So with the construction of the modern network of roads, many outsiders with no interest in long-term preservation of fisheries, they gained access to this region, and they had taken to routine poisoning and dynamiting of river pools, and this led to a depletion of fisher stock. And interestingly, once this tradition was destroyed, even the local people joined in this pernicious practice. That is what Professor Gadgil writes. So again, you can see here that you had this tradition which had its rules, which had its threat of excommunication and all of that. And then modernity happened. There's a new network of roads, and there's a lot of outsiders who cannot relate it to this tradition who came by. And then they started like getting in the resource exploitative mindset of modernity into it. And they took to routine poisoning and dynamiting of the poles. And that led to a loss of fisher stock and loss of ecological balance in general. And then the local people also, then they'll start competing for the same, and they also stop respecting their own traditions. So this is kind of the interplay of how traditions, resource modernity, and like resource management, and then the demands of modernity from developmentalism kind of interacts. So there are lessons to be drawn there. Similarly, he also draws another example of the Gond communities in the Gadgil district in Maharashtra, where they waited for a particular day in the year to collect the produce of the trees like Amla, Chironji, and Mohua. So only after they are all matured and ready to harvest, that is when the plucking is done. A particular ceremony happens called Polo, and it's also, I think, in other parts of the world, it's also called Pola. Uh, um, in other parts of the country, and there are similar rituals and festivals associated as well. So typically that is like the harvesting day. Some call it as the Thanksgiving day as well. And nobody goes out for work and everybody gets together for a community feast. And that's really the day when this produce is really collected and harvested. So here, this tradition again lapsed under the control of the forest department because the people lost their autonomy. They felt the forest department is the one that is controlling the produce. So even if we continue with this festival, there is no guarantee that we'll get our produce that day. So they abandoned the tradition. And as a result, whole branches of trees whose fruit was in great demand would often be cut down before the fruit was mature. Because once the traditional and the community policing mechanism is lost, there is nothing that is stopping the forestry department or even a business interest from like going for a wholesale resource exploitation. And destructive harvesting is a result of this. And interestingly, the community revived the tradition only after community rights were gotten back in 2009. That is what Professor Gadgil writes. So this is again a great example of nature culture interplay, and also of how state as an entity coming in, community losing its rights, and community losing its autonomy. So you can, in this particular episode, you can see all of this play out. That there was a tradition, and the tradition was there for a reason, and community respected the tradition, and also enjoyed the secular benefits out of respecting that tradition. Then the forestry department enters, business interests coming in, modernity starts playing into the equation, and that kind of upsets the whole thing. And in this particular case, thankfully, the community got back the rights, and there's a lot of backstory around it. And this community then revived the tradition. So for a lot of our tradition, I think this kind of applies because Hindus in general are not habituated to this centralized state or a state bureaucracy kind of interface, and they always used to operate through these community entities, be it your caste or sampradaya bodies or your village bodies or your nagara grama vana, that whole interface. That's how we used to operate. And perhaps the fact that the state continues to have a colonial character is why the affairs are still the way they are. That's perhaps one way of looking at it. Now that gives a nice segue into this other book, which is also written by Professor Gadgil in collaboration with Ramchandra Guha. That's really where the first time I got into this whole caste ecology sort of a discourse. So in this book, Gadgil and Guha have written about some of these concepts here around caste as a ecological prudence mechanism and all of that. So very interestingly, they start this book with they had to give like an apology because caste is this whole like a taboo word in a lot of circles, and the only emotion that's supposed to come out on caste is negative, and it's mostly like 100% criticism kind of thing. You're not allowed to say even like 5%, 10%, anything positive about caste. So since in this book they had written like this, they were even accused of a Brahminical bias, as Guha and Gadgil mentioned in this book, that they were charged with promoting that the caste system as an eco-friendly alternative to present patterns of resource use. So just because they spoke about caste in this context, they were accused of being casteist essentially. And this is something that a lot of us are familiar on the internet. The moment you speak about anything around caste which is not in the guilt tripping or self-flagellatory mode, you get accused as being a casteist. So I think this is something that even the authors have faced, and despite their own misgivings on this system, as evidenced at the early part of the talk, despite Gadgil's own misgivings and Gadgil's own negative judgments on a lot of aspects, they were still criticized just because they also spoke about some positives. I think that's pretty much how things are even today as we continue to grapple with this particular topic. So here, the authors also refer to the great historian E.P. Thompson, who in the review of this book, he said that this section is the most innovative section for complementing and also providing an explanation for the origins and persistence of the caste. That this whole ecological prudence perspective is very different from the typical lens from which caste is seen. So just to elaborate on this particular topic, the whole idea that Professor Gadgil tries to draw here is that he sees caste in the sense of uh, how it managed ecological issues in terms of how caste is like a traditional ecological prudence mechanism. And here, Gadgil talks about some inspiration from biology. So he's referring to a particular conversation he had with a large group of people at one point in time in early 20th century, where they discussed at length about how communities of biological species are organized, and they have this concept of non-overlapping niches. So one species will have one niche and it doesn't overlap with the niche of another species. And this is here that the non-overlapping occupations seem to resemble the non-overlapping ecological niches of castes. That is what Gadgil says. Again, given his whole background, he also cautions, saying, of course, both of these are cultural artifacts without a biological basis. As Buddha had pointed out, he's referring to that conversation on the Ashtalayana Sutta. And he's just trying to say that there is a reason why things are the way they are, but don't worry, it's just a cultural artifact. There's no it's not science. There's no biology behind it. I think that's the way perhaps he reconciled his own negativities around caste and then some of these positive aspects or nature-like aspects that he found in caste. Again, as I said, that dichotomy is very interesting to notice. So here, there's a article available on the internet, which Professor Gadgil and Professor Kailash Malhotra wrote together. This is on this whole concept of how did India's caste system last for so many centuries. So here, again, Gadgil talks about caste has become the greatest curses on the modern Indian society, and he talks about his discussion with Kailash Malhotra on how such a flawed system persisted only among Hindus of all societies in the world. And then they kind of start thinking that maybe there is some advantage in the historical past, that is why it persisted. And they hypothesize that this advantage may have resided in some aspects of the system which facilitated sustainable use of resources. The caste system was somehow related to traditions of ecological prudence. And any community that has traditionally dependent on a particular renewable natural resource, it will evolve regulation for sustained utilization and strict protection of that particular resource. So that's how they kind of justify how the caste system lasted this long. And throughout this section of the book, Professor Gadgil tries to validate some of this hypothesis in terms of how caste kind of persisted. So there are a few examples here, and maybe in another 10 minutes, I'll try to wrap up this talk. So here again, it's just a follow-up to what we saw before. So caste is compared to a biological species. And Gadgil says that Indian society is an agglomeration of several thousand endogamous groups or castes, each with a restricted geographical range and a hereditarily determined mode of subsistence. And the castes, reproductively isolated because of cultural barriers, may be compared to biological species. And the society as a whole can be thought of as a biological community with each caste having its own specific ecological niche. So here he's trying to, given his whole background in biology and ecology, he's trying to understand why caste system persisted so many centuries, and he's trying to like draw a parallel in terms of how caste can perhaps be seen as if you were to translate biology into constructing of society, perhaps this is how it would be. So that's where he says that caste may be compared to biological species. And then here he writes about how this whole concept evolved and how there are now conflicts. So here they are talking about a particular plant or an animal resource in a given locality was used almost exclusively by that given lineage within a caste, generation after generation. And then this, it had favored the cultural evolution of traditions, ensuring the sustainable use of natural resources and contributed significantly to the stability of the Indian caste society over centuries. So they are trying to explain how caste persisted over centuries and then seeing some rationale in terms of this whole comparison with how biological species operated. And they also see a parallel in terms of like what we spoke earlier, that if you are staying in a particular geography and you have a particular natural resource dependency and mapping for your community, and you are just staying there generation after generation, you'll build your own regulation mechanism and governance mechanisms because you are concerned for the intergenerational sustenance of your own community and those resources. And that's how they see the evolution of caste as a system. And as you can see here, there's a reference to there's a lineage within the caste. There's a generation after generation cycle that is kind of repeating. And then they say that the collapse of the base of natural resources and increasing monetization of the economy, beginning with the colonial rule, it has destroyed the entire, like the earlier complementarity between different castes. And this led to increasing conflicts between them in recent times. So that is one interpretation they have to explain how, like how things were and how things are now. So here there is again a reference to regulating competition. And here also a lot of times in this book, one would also see that there's a lot of reference to like forest communities and communities that are working very closely with a particular natural resource. But that is not to say that those concepts have no application, let's say for people who are staying in a village or let's say people of the plains, the way they are called. So here Gadgil knows that he notes that in such a caste society, the cultivator castes, though they are occupying identical niches, they also coexisted through intra and intercaste territoriality in the form of ownership of cultivated land. And then the artisan and service castes, they are dependent on these uh, castes that are cultivating the land. And these artisan and service castes, they had diversified their niches in terms of their occupation. So that there were members of only one caste, each of carpenter, like potter, barber, etc., in any given village. And furthermore, they regulated the intra-caste competition through the device of each household of artisan or service caste having the exclusive right of dealing with a specific group of cultivators and other caste households. So this is pretty much a description of how the village society used to operate before. It kind of goes back to that earlier discussion we had on the Gao Gada book, which also talks about a similar society, although it also is critical at times in that book. So here I have given a reference to a talk by some of friends who I know from my past university education. So this particular talk, there's also a reference to a Jajmani system, which is again very similar to what is being spoken of here. And there's more there, that it's not just about the resource management aspects. There's a lot more around it. There's of course there are other similar systems. The Gaokari system that we talked about in Goa itself is an example of this. There's also the Balutidari system, which is also quite well known and documented by sociology researchers and otherwise in Maharashtra. So we have this kind of system operating everywhere as well. Again, just to caution, it is not to say that like nobody can really replicate this kind of a system in today's world, because nobody knows how to ensure livelihood security and nobody can even assign a mode of livelihood to anybody. So this is not in the sense of trying to replicate this in contemporary world. It is in terms of understanding why things are the way they are and trying to understand particularly from an ecological sort of a lens. So here the reference is that caste played a role in terms of regulating competition. Now, there's another example given where caste also played a role in resource partitioning. So there's a concept of non-overlapping niches. So here, Gadgil writes about the interdependent relationships between small single clan settlements of two endogamous groups, Kumbis and Gavlis in Ambi Valley near the crest of Western Ghats. So here again, you have a situation where cultivation in valleys and lower hill slopes was restricted to Kumbis, and on the hill terraces and hilltops, it was to the Gavlis. The maintenance of the livestock and use of fodder and grazing resources was largely with Gavlis, while Kumbis had a monopoly on hunting wild animals. This is a clear-cut example of non-overlap of culturally determined niches of two endogamous groups, Gadgil says. And such resource partitioning ensured that both groups could protect the resources over which they had monopoly and long-term group interest. Thereby, they were promoting many ecologically prudent practices. And he also writes about how these practices of prudence saw a breakdown even as early as 1971 with the pressure of modern economic forces. So this is another example of again two castes here. So there is a caste called Makadwala, which has a primary occupation. They have this practice of displaying some domesticated animals for entertainment or religious purposes. But as a complementary occupation, they are basket weavers. And in that aspect, they also have a conflict with other basket weaving communities like the Kaikadis, and this picture is of a Kaikadi woman from the internet. So here, the way this resource partitioning is done is that the Makadwala can do basket weaving, but he can do it exclusively with the leaves of a particular plant. And another basket weaving community of the Kaikadis, they'll do it exclusively with bamboo. So here, caste is playing the role of resource partitioning. This is another example of the Nandiwalas. So Nandiwalas, as you can see in the picture, it's familiar to a lot of people down south. In the Telugu place where I come from, we call them Gangiredlavaru. So these are people who essentially in particular times in the year, they display the sacred bull in the cities, and they also perform some functions like they sing some sacred songs, and they have their own roles defined for ritual purposes. So there are two related communities that Gadgil talks about. The one is called Tirumal Nandiwalas, and another is called Full Mali Nandiwalas. They have a similar way of making living. Their culture is also identical. Both trace back to the same ancestral stock in Andhra Pradesh. So they moved from Andhra Pradesh to some part in Maharashtra. However, they avoid competing with each other by evolving ranges that show no geographical overlap. So the base camp villages in rainy season from where these Nandiwalas eke a livelihood, they are different from both the groups. So the Tirumal Nandiwalas have a different group, the Full Mali Nandiwalas have a different group. And these traditions have a recorded history of a few hundred years easily. So these are examples of how competition was avoided between castes, and even though they had identical ecological niches, in this case, both had the same job of displaying the sacred bull, but they have like a partition defined. So here he talks about what changed with British rule. And with the advent of British rule, it heralded the dismantling of the system that promoted the prudent use of natural resources. And the British imposed a much higher level of demand on natural resources of the country to furnish raw materials for their economy. To avoid having to pay for the exploitation of these resources, they took over as government property vast resources which until then were owned communally. So these castes, jatis, and community bodies, they used to own resources which the state took over, the British state took over. And these resources were then rapidly depleted through commercial exploitation. So that mode of exploitation didn't have any sense of sacred, didn't have any traditional guardrails also. So this led to considerable impoverishment and often complete collapse of the natural resource base, sustaining many components of the Indian society. With this collapse of the resource base and the replacement of the old system of the barter by money economy, it destroyed traditional relationships amongst various castes in Indian society. And that's how caste is now a net negative to the society, is what Gadgil kind of alludes to. He says that the result of these trends of British colonialism and the modernity of industrialism, that caste didn't collapse. What happened is that neither did the iniquities and injustices whatsoever, they didn't vanish. Far from this being the case, the restriction of marriages and the limitation of the recognition of social responsibility within the group, that continues unchanged throughout rural and to a lesser extent in urban India. The persistence of caste with a loss of this traditional complementarity, that has led to an increasing level of caste conflicts, they say. So the destruction of the ecological resource space has therefore rendered the once possibly adaptive organization of the caste society totally maladaptive. In fact, it has now become an impediment in coming to terms with new modes of resource utilization to which our society must adapt. And it is indeed a very difficult task to break out of the hold of this maladaptive system. That is kind of Gadgil's commentary on the caste system today, that he acknowledges its role in the past. He acknowledges the damage caused by British colonialism and industrial modernity. And then we are left here wondering like what to do with the system now. It's not doing the very same exact role that it was doing before. Neither can we make it work the way it was working before. Neither is it going away, and what to do with it. So I think that's kind of like an open question to many of us as well. So just to conclude, I just have a couple of slides from here. So on this trajectory of moving forward with understanding what the colonial epoch did to our own conservation mindset, in this part of the book, Professor Gadgil writes about the wild pig menace, and this is a topic that he continues to write on public portals to this day, where he talks about how the traditional way of managing did not ban hunting of a particular animal. It had limits on hunting, but it didn't ban hunting. But we have this draconian laws today, like the Wildlife Protection Act, which just say that if you hunt a particular species, then you'll be in jail. And then here he draws a contrast that this is not how things used to operate before. And we now have this whole wild boar menace where they are attacking human habitats, they are attacking farms, and then the farmers cannot react because killing these animals have their own legal implications. So he talks about how these laws themselves were constructed in a like a colonial sort of a worldview, and it is about time that they all changed. And here he also refers to how forestry changed pre-British and post-British. So again, as alluded to through multiple uh, times during this talk and through the book, he keeps talking about how village communities, though they had against practices such as untouchability, they functioned as cohesive communities and organized cultivation and payment of taxes through arrangements. They successfully maintained village woodlots, grazing lots, sacred groves, ponds, stretches of rivers, sacred plants, and animals. And this is a distinction we lost because the British had the distinction of wiping out their own forests and wildlife and abolishing community-based management of resources. At the same time, British also led the world in nurturing science and technologies and ushering industrial revolution. So this is all happening kind of together, where British wipe out their own forests and wildlife and they abolish their own community management systems. Then industrial revolution happens. Then they sort of expand, colonization happens, and they bring that worldview into wherever they go. So their interests lay in either usurping the resources of colonies in toto, largely, or enslaving the native inhabitants, as they did in North America and Australia, or where the natives could not be eliminated or enslaved wholesale, as in India and many other Asian countries, they chose to drain the colonies in manifold ways, which is what really happened with starting the colonial epoch. And here he talks about British attitudes to conservation and colonization. And he kind of goes back even like to about 1086, 1066, which is the early 11th century, to explain what changed. So this whole colonizer attitude towards resources in colonies, it goes back pretty much to that particular era. And it started there. The result was disastrous. Britain lost a lot of its forest and wildlife. And that process of mindless deforestation and extermination that continued from 14th century onwards when colonization began. So that's how the trajectory sort of happened. And the British colonization for Indian forestry resources, this is how it happened, as alluded to through multiple parts of the book and through this talk. So there was a state takeover of community lands, and there was a claim over all take trees as property of the British East India Company. And the British, in this particular example, he is talking about the ships of the Maratha Navy, what you can see on the screen. So the British saw the robust take ships of the Maratha Navy, and they wanted the timber as a substitute for the exhausted oak of their own land. So to build their own ships, they needed resources, and they were envious of the Maratha Navy. So in the process, once colonization happened, the network sacred groves in the country got destroyed in the Western Ghats, and they also destroyed ruthlessly whatever was remaining of the sacred groves, and they also took over the take plantations of the Maratha Navy. So I think there's a lot of emphasis in the book in terms of how colonial modernity, a lot of us really in contemporary times today need to also understand this, because many a time without understanding all of this, we tend to blame our traditions and our past. So here he also draws reference to a particular character called Dietrich Brandis, who the British invited in terms of help on how to manage resources. So he favored local community management, but then the British had economic interest, and so they just didn't listen to whatever Brandis suggested. So they overruled Brandis, and they took over whatever the communities had. So again, these are just examples. I'll just quickly run through this because we spoke about this in quite some detail in the early part of the talk. So here again, Gadgil refers to a lot of traditions of prudence, where traditional communities managed their resources, and they had rules and they had governance mechanisms. So Heronries in a particular village near Bangalore, they strictly protected painted storks and grey pelicans breeding in the midst of the village. But the same birds may be hunted outside the breeding season. So here there are breeding season restrictions that in the breeding seasons don't hunt. Similarly, a nomadic hunting tribe of Pasepadis, if they find when they are out hunting and they find a pregnant antelope, they again have a rule saying that this animal is pregnant, let's not hunt it. And then in Maharashtra, again, referring to Mangaon and Ambi Valley, there's a sacred grove where again a particular a deer has a refugia there, and outside of it, it can still be hunted. This is similar to what was spoken about earlier at a different sacred grove as well. So this is pretty much how we had all of these traditions of prudence. And in each of these examples, we can see that there is a balance between use and then between regulation. So as it is popularly caricatured, it is not a choice between poverty, starvation, and abundance. It is about disciplined living with a sense of limits. So Gadgil here refers to how British launched a great massacre of India's wildlife from 1757 to 1818, disregarding all these traditions. So this is something that we should all be mindful of. So Gadgil's personal experiences, he censures Indian traditions for a lot of regressive practices. However, he's also careful enough to not dismiss all of it and acknowledges aspects of ecological prudence and resource governance in them. But a lot of current day policymakers, businessmen, and consumers themselves, they lack this nuance and they have surrendered to colonial ways in toto. And the result shows in the way we treat our natural resources to this day. Perhaps this is also because, and this is where, like these are really my own observations, that this is because our own failing to reimagine a community without having to fall back on the caste-based identity. Cooperative movements and some village-level community initiatives show a semblance of a caste-agnostic community formation, but I mean they are not dependent on state, but they are not scalable, sustainable, modern, sorry, they're not scalable, sustainable, and they're not proven alternatives. So some of these again go back to some community formulations which we may consider as pre-modern or anti-modern. So there is no real scalable, sustainable solution that exists today. And perhaps it is because of this and several pressures on modern Indian industrial economy that we end up ceding whatever little community spaces that we are left with. So individuals are actually left alone and ever dependent on top-down entities. So we are dependent on the state, we are dependent on the market. We don't have any community level entity that exists, and that's why the way we manage nature is the way it is. So here Gadgil refers to one particular example of how bamboos are managed in a particular mill. So Gadgil became friends with some of these paper mill managers, and he asked them that if they are not worried that the bamboo stocks will get exhausted because of the way they are operating, and there's a lot of pollution that is coming out of it and all of that. And then these mill managers, they then say that they are in the business of making money and they are not in the business of making paper, and they don't care for bamboo. In the first decade of the operation itself, the mill had already paid for itself many times over. And they say that once the bamboo is finished, they have the option of closing down that business, and they'll invest the money elsewhere and move to, let's say, something like manganese mining. For the villagers and the fishermen or basket weavers who are dependent on bamboo, they may not have such an option. And this is the contrast that Gadgil also drew with the fisherman example that I quoted earlier as well. So again, I think this is something that keeps coming back to a lot of us. And this is just a concluding slide. So here we are talking about development and externalities. So the current model of development, it leads to a lot of pollution, resource depletion, and all of this, loss of tradition. These are all externalities. And these external, without being mindful of these externalities and this cost, we end up permitting business interests to pollute air and water with impunity. And this is what is termed as crony capitalism. And under British rule, this manner of running a business was admitted because we said they are colonizers, they are colonizing us. But there is no explanation for independent India operating the same methods, because there is no point in us colonizing ourselves. That is something that Gadgil alludes to. And here he gives a couple of examples, like we are all familiar of the Bhopal gas tragedy. So here he gives an example where when the tragedy actually happened, there was a particular official who says that we must rush there and try to hush up the incident. Otherwise, the wretched people of this country will make hue and cry and stop all industrial progress. So this kind of operates even today. We see all environmentalism as anti-development and anti-industry. So our attitude is always to hush up all these concerns. And the Gadgil talks about how this doesn't have a parallel anywhere else. He talks about how similar cases in Switzerland where they came up with these issues and then they found out their own governance mechanism, and eventually the river got better. So he talks about an example of river pollution there. Similarly, he talks about how Japan had a lot of regulation built in, and from that they innovated and came up with fuel efficient automobiles. And how Finland also went through all of this, where there were paper mills, there were accusations of water pollution, and they developed zero effluent technologies. So what Gadgil talks about is that by allowing pollution to go unabated in India, we are allowing the industry to make undue profits and remain inefficient in the global market. So this is again important perspective, because we view the environmental discourse as anti-industrialization, but perhaps that's not the only way to look at these things. And of course, just to conclude, Gadgil's major work has been around Western Ghats protection and conservation. And it's been so many years now. There was first the Gadgil report, then there was a Kasturi Rangan committee, and now there is one more committee put in. Nothing much is still happening on this line. So some of the work that Gadgil himself has done on ecology is still in the shelves and in the dustbins, really. And that perhaps is a sad commentary to how we look at ecology and development dichotomy today. So just to conclude, this book is an important contribution to the environment development discourse in the country. Anyone who is keen on understanding this whole ecology, economy, environment development conundrums, specifically in the Indian context, should consider reading it. We should understand the Dharma ecology economy interface, understand what changed in the colonial epoch, and then after, which is the independent India era. We should cultivate an empathetic understanding towards traditional knowledge systems and traditional social systems. So despite having all like so many misgivings, Gadgil continue to have a lot of empathy to how like why things are the way they are. And that is really where there's an analogy to Chesterton's fence, that Chesterton's fence really says that if you're trying to remove a fence, you should first understand why the fence was there in the first place. Why did people even establish that fence? So we need to really look at our own traditional knowledge systems and traditional social systems with that lens, particularly when on matters like ecology and economy. We need to put community entities at the center and not just individual state or the market. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I know it was like a heavy topic, but this is a topic that demands attention, reading, and concentration. And I hope that more and more people who are today taking up causes around Hinduism, civilizational renaissance, Indic causes, and all of that, I hope they also shift their gaze towards these aspects and then take this discourse forward. That this is something that needs to get more and more into the public spaces, because this is something that concerns all of us as people. So that's pretty much what I had. I know it was a bit longer than what I had anticipated. So thanks for listening.